And finally, something that we're going to come on to now with Shane Mockler from Capex Associates.
Right on cue, I think, Johnsy. It's just joined us. I was worried there, Shane, that you weren't going to appear.
Good evening, all. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Fantastic.
There's no stamp duty up to 125,000, but I'll not go into that. I'll let Shane take over and take the floor. And over to you, Shane.
Great. Well, thank you very much, guys. So good evening, all. I'm going to speak to you for no longer than 5 minutes regarding some stamp duty relief that could save you thousands of pounds. Don't worry, there's only 3 categories to discuss. I'm not going to bore you with chapter and verse of tax law. But before I do go into that, and so I can make it all relevant to you, there are a couple of areas within stamp duty that I'd just like to explain so that the subsequent information makes sense. So they are, first of all, it's higher rates for additional dwellings. Now, if I could see you all, I'd ask for a show of hands. Who knows what this is? But what I'm going to do is just explain it in its most simplest form, which means that essentially you pay a 3% surcharge rate of stamp duty on any additional dwelling. Now, what is an additional dwelling? An additional dwelling is simply a property other than the house that you live in. The other one is multiple dwelling relief, or MDR as it's known. In its most simplest form, it means that where the more than one dwelling is being purchased, you can essentially split the total acquisition price, which usually saves some sort of quite large sums. Now, to introduce the tax and touching on what Michael said at the start of the meeting. Now, until March of this year, HMRC haven't really published any guidance based on the legislation. So there's always been some grey areas in stamp duty land tax. But as well as that, over the past few years, student accommodation has become increasingly popular amongst investors. Now, why do you guys think that is? I mean, for me personally, I feel that as well as a shortage of supply, committed 12-month tenancies, high yields, and council tax exemptions, one reason is because of student landlords can qualify for stamp duty land tax relief, where the higher rates for additional dwellings, as mentioned earlier, are exempt. Now, onto the 3 areas as discussed. So please hold on to your hats all. Category 1. Although this isn't going to be applicable to the large majority of investors, it's prudent to differentiate the difference between them. Student halls of residence, usually owned and or managed by the educational institutions that the students attend, are for social purposes not capable of being classified as a dwelling. So essentially what this means is that they're outside the scope for the higher rates and for multiple dwelling relief. A prime example of this is a property owned by the university on the main campus. Now, what this means is that HMRC and the government classify these properties as non-residential. So they'll be charged at the non-residential rates, just like any shop, industrial unit or hotel would be. Category 2 is the main area of interest for all of you, specifically for PBSA. So regular student accommodation, other than halls of residence that are owned by private landlords and obliged to be, that's the word, obliged to be for the sole benefit of students, are charged to the residential rates of stamp duty, but exempt from the higher rates. Multiple dwelling relief would be available in this instance too. As mentioned, an example of this is purpose-built student accommodation. This is the bread and butter qualifying type of property, to be honest. What this means for stamp duty purposes is that if you buy student units for under £125,000 or indeed £250,000 until the end of September, then you shouldn't pay any stamp duty at all. Category 3, pretty much exactly the same as category 2. However, this is an instances where the properties are not obliged to be for students. So they're treated as residential, but the higher rates are chargeable. Now, an example of this is a HMO that is rented to both students and non-students, or potentially students and staff members at the university. What this means is that the purchase for stamp duty purposes will be treated as any other regular buy-to-let investment, really. Okay, so for those of you guys that are still awake after all of that, this covers the 3 areas of student accommodation and hopefully provides you with some information to consider. If knowing this relief makes student investing more appealing to you, then great, as this was the intention of the government who actually created the legislation. So what I'd now like to do, guys, is that's enough from me. So I'd like to open up to any questions, firstly on the panel, and then anyone who's listening.
Well, I mean, thanks very much, Shane. Really appreciate that. You summarised it really well. I mean, there may be some investors on this webinar that have perhaps wrongly paid stamp duty on properties that they've recently completed on or a couple of years ago. Is there a service you can offer for those clients to help claim some of that back, or is it just from now onwards?
It's a good question you asked. Now, essentially, the way HMRC advise is that within a 12-month period from the purchase date, that's the prime opportunity to sort of recover those funds, so to speak. But we can actually go past 4 years. As I mentioned, the guidance from HMRC has been so lacking in the past until this year that's a good argument for any properties up until 4 years in the past to be able to reclaim, essentially.
On the overseas side of it, Shane, that 2% non-UK resident SDLT, will that be applicable? Will overseas investors be paying that 2%?
It's a good question, and the answer to that is yes, they will. Now, the way that they've worded the legislation, although the higher rates didn't apply, the non-resident rates will apply. Essentially, what that means is that, as I mentioned before, up to £125,000, instead of paying nothing, you'll be paying 2% for these residents. Now, a lot of overseas investors are buying multiple units in one go. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, but when you buy multiple units in one go, the minimum amount that you will pay is 1% of the total transaction price, whereas what overseas investors are doing is paying 2%. So really, when you're buying multiples, there's not much of a scope to be put off for overseas investors, if that all makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Patrick's just asked a question, Shane. I don't know if you can see that. He said, nothing here for student HMOs, or have I misunderstood? Do you want to just quickly clarify for Patrick's purposes on the stamp duty for student HMOs?
Yeah, of course. So student HMOs, if they are obliged to be for students, now PBSA is quite an easily identifiable qualifying criteria. One of the main pieces of evidence that we have to provide to HMRC, excuse me, is that the properties are obliged to be solely for students. So PBSA, as I say, great example, but that doesn't mean HMOs aren't included. No, we can actually also claim for HMOs, but the main criteria would be that at the point you purchase it, it needs to be operating as student investment. So let's say, for example, you've bought it off a family who are using it as their residential home. That's more difficult to qualify. But what I would suggest is that if you do have an inquiry, every case is different. So please feel free to reach out and I'll happily advise.
That's great. And yeah, as Shane says, anyone who wants to speak to Shane, we'll send the link across to people and we can make an introduction that way. I think there's actually a page on our website which Jason's created, so hopefully that will be on the right-hand side as well, which you're welcome to click on and book a consultation with him on it. Rowan's just asked another question. On buy-to-let properties for students, do they have to be brand new or can they be refurbished to qualify, Shane?
They can be brand new or refurbished, to be honest with you. The main reason why the relief is available is because of the shortage, really, of student accommodation, and because that's what the government are looking for people to invest in people's futures. So, yes, you can qualify refurbished homes, but as I say, it would need to be some form of interaction with the criteria is being used as a student let at the point of purchase. Now, that's the narrative. You can read into that what you will, really. You know, you could argue that if you put the relevant insurances in place and you change the council tax rates, then what that would mean is that already qualifies at the point of purchase. But as I say, every case is different, so the potential is there to qualify that.
And that might relate to Patrick's new question you just put in there, Shane, that his properties are refurbished and during his ownership. So he's asked if there's any mileage there worth speaking with yourself, as he bought them in late 2019 and one last month, which isn't yet registered. So yes, worth a chat, Shane, on that with Patrick.
Yeah, definitely. Just as I mentioned before, there's some reliefs that when it goes to the point of 12 months after the point of purchase, HMRC just won't look at. You know, what people don't realise is there's 49 reliefs and exemptions. Now, the particular relief we're mentioning is being so difficult for people to qualify and has caused so many issues in this industry purely because their guidance wasn't up to standard until recently. So definitely anything until 2017, to be honest, we can look at.
And sometimes solicitors don't help, Shane, do they? From our experience, we get some that tell some that say don't. It's
a great point you make. Now, solicitors are appointed by HMRC to collect the funds on their behalf. the reason that they're appointed is because they're the best place to do it. You know, the solicitors can make sure that the properties don't complete until everything's in order. So they're best place to do it. But what HMRC are asking by that is they're asking legal professionals who have spent years to acquire their status to give tax advice, which will then take more years to learn in that regard as well. So it creates an advice vacuum whereby so many transactions overpay. It's estimated that it's 1 in 4 transactions overpay. And to be honest, I can believe that.
Yeah.
No, that's really useful. And Patrick's saying for you to talk after this, Shane, on that. So, and I'm sure there'll be more watching as well. That'll be key for it. So,
Perfect. Thank you.
A big thank you from us, Shane. That's cleared up a lot for us. It really helps. So, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thank you, guys.